Hello, everyone. My name is Joshua Borths, and I am the head of the directing staff at Des Moines Metro Opera, and I'm so excited to welcome you to the first of our Prelude talks for our 2020 virtual festival. I'm coming to you live from Columbus, Ohio, from Capital University, where I'm the director of opera and musical theater, as well as the music history professor here. And so I'm excited to, on this wonderful Sunday, dress up as if we're off to the opera and talk to you about one of my favorite pieces in the French repertoire, Jules Massenet's Manon. But before we do, I want to quickly just shout out the fact that the four main stage Sunday broadcasts that you'll be experiencing throughout the next 4 weeks, Manon, Rusalka, Billy Budd, and La Conterie, represent four masterpieces of opera. And they're also four pieces that you probably can't see very often. And so I think it's worth noting the courage and the bravery of not only the Des Moines Metro Opera staff and artistic team, but also the audiences and patrons like yourselves who show up year after year to experience these wonderful works that don't always get their due on modern operatic stages. And so we start today with Massenet's Manon. This piece premiered in 1884 at the Opéra Comique, and that is a very specific term that we'll talk about in just a minute. So hopefully by the end of our time together today, you'll have a deeper sense of the style of this piece and what to really watch for and what to listen for. This opera is based on a very famous novel from the early 18th century. It was published in the 1730s by a French writer named the Abbé Prévost, who was a priest, writer, right as the novel is getting off the ground. This is a mammoth work that inspired many artists throughout the subsequent centuries, and it tells the story of Des, who is a young student who falls in love with this young woman named Manon in one section of the novel. And we essentially see how they both grapple with this relationship, how they decide whether to go with the society that they have been born into, or whether they'll make a different choice and follow their heart. This novel, when it first premiered, was first published, was salacious. Everyone read the sections about Manon, the fiery passion they had for each other, the glittering worlds in which Manon finds herself and Des finds himself, and the novel was banned. Now, those of you who saw Candide last year at Des Moines Metro Opera learned a little bit about Voltaire's classic Candide, you know that the second that a novel is banned, it is going to become a bestseller. And Manon was no exception. And so its influences can be seen throughout French literature, throughout French art moving forward. It was famously adapted into a ballet. It was adapted into another opera by Puccini. It was one of his first early masterpieces. And so this is a story that captured imaginations, and I hope captures yours this afternoon as well, or whenever you are streaming this production of Manon. I think it's important in these pre-show lectures to take a moment to really put yourself in the mindset of someone who is sitting down to see this for the first time. What was it like to be an audience member in the 1880s in France? And so I'm going to throw a lot at you today, a lot about French culture, a lot about French history. The point of this is not to give you a test at the end like I may some of my music history students or opera students, but to really just wrap our brains around what it must have felt like to be at this premiere so that you're in the right headspace to appreciate this piece for the first time, for the 10th time, or whatever way you are seeing this piece, that you're approaching it with fresh new eyes by learning a little bit about the context in which it came to be. So I want to start off by talking about France itself. France, throughout the 18th and 19th centuries, was a tumultuous time. You'll notice here on this slide a list of all of the different governments that existed in France throughout the 18th and 19th centuries. That is a lot of turnover. That is a lot of revolution. Every single one of these governments was preceded by a violent revolution, in some cases apocalyptically so, that changed French government, changed French society on a dime. You'll notice this first bullet point is the ancien regime, the ancient regime. And this was the structure that governed French society throughout much of the Middle Ages up through most of the 1700s, the 18th century. This was a very rigid system that had the king at the top, and then moving through the aristocracy on down through society, you had this very rigid pyramid structure that existed throughout. It was virtually impossible to change your rung on the ladder, if you will. Very few freedoms were afforded to women. Very few freedoms were afforded to anyone who was not wealthy, powerful, and at the top of the system. This was a very oppressive style of government. It was a very oppressive society. That's why, or one of the reasons I should say, why the French Revolution broke out at the end of the 1700s. And so when we look at the world of Manon, the original novel is set during the Ancien Regime. We're talking about a world that is oppressive. Now, much French culture is about elegance. It's about grace. It's about effervescence. You see beautiful clothing. You see beautiful furniture pieces, beautiful music. And all of this was a way to subtly, or not so subtly, say that you are wealthy, to say that you are powerful, to say that you have a God-given right to be in charge of other people. And so underneath the surface of all of this elegance, underneath the surface of this effervescence, you have this fear, you have this oppression. And we have to keep that in mind as we see the story of Manon unfold for us this afternoon. In 1789, the French Revolution breaks out. And for the first time in Europe, we see peasants rising up, and we see the decapitation of Charles XVI, the King of France. This was a watershed moment in Western civilization and subsequently took us through all of these different governments, this time of great instability in Paris. Let's say that you're a French Parisian and you're born in the year 1800. Your parents were probably born under this oppressive Ancien Regime that we've been talking about and that you'll see depicted on stage in Manon. You then are grappling with the fact that the French Revolution is new. And as you're born in the year 1800, the French find themselves under the rule of an emperor. So they got rid of their king, and now we have an emperor by the name of Napoleon Bonaparte. Then we set off another period of war as the Napoleonic Wars of conquest spread across all of Europe, a time of incredible turmoil, of lots of stress and change in European society. In 1815, Napoleon is eventually beaten, and we have the restoration of the monarchy. They try to turn back the clock. That becomes another oppressive monarchy. There is again revolution. We get a new liberal monarch that lasts until 1830. So if you're a French peasant who was born in Paris in 1800, you're 30 years old. Look at how much change you have lived through. There was then another revolution, which brought on another democratic republic, which then brought on, when the Napoleon III rises up, the nephew of Napoleon Bonaparte himself, we get another empire. And then finally in 1870, Napoleon III is vanquished, and we get another republic, another form of democracy. My head is spinning. And if yours is as well, then that gives us a little insight into what life must have felt like for those living in Paris during this period. So the question that we have to ask ourselves is, how do we react to this? How did the French look at this period of turmoil, this period that's constantly redefining what it means to be French? What did they have to grab onto? I know in our tumultuous times today, all of us are looking for some kind of stability in our lives. So where did the Parisians find it? Where did the Parisians grab onto what it meant to be French and what it meant to be a part of their culture? They looked for it and they found it in their arts, in their food, in their music, in their drama, in their architecture, in their fashion. This is what governed French life. This is where people found solace in the middle of such a tumultuous time. And opera, French opera, is one of those wonderful categories that the French really dove into. I think it's fascinating, and it's worth taking time to note that in the this tumultuous world where the aristocratic norms are changing, where kings are losing their head, peasants are being oppressed, everyone is fighting for freedom and then having it restricted once again, that French opera, a style of art that began in the glittering courts of the Sun King, an almost godlike figure in French history, managed to survive and adapt and thrive. That this managed, in the midst of all this turmoil, to be a constant. And as you may know, if you've taken any French language courses, maybe in high school, college, maybe you visited France in the past, that when the French love something, when they cherish it, when it's a part of French culture, then it must be codified and it must be given a lot of rules. And that shows that the French love it. If you look at French cuisine, it has a reputation sometimes for being fussy. That's because they love it so much. The French language has so many different rules and irregularities because they love it and cherish it so much, and opera is no exception. French opera is distinct from the other styles of opera that maybe you have seen on the stages of Des Moines Metro Opera or in other opera houses around the world, and it is contrasted with the Italian and German styles in the 1800s, and that's worth noting. Italian opera, the first operas and continuing throughout the 1800s, these pieces are, now granted, I'm going to greatly simplify here, but these pieces are focused on the human voice. Everything in the opera, the story, the orchestra, everything is about supporting the emotion and the technique of the singer. It is no accident that the Italian style of singing and the Italian style of opera that was predominant in this period was called bel canto, called beautiful singing. It is about the singer. The Germans, on the other hand, were all about the musical structures themselves. Opera, in the works of Mozart on, and by the time we get to Massenet, we're talking about the operas of Wagner. These are operas that are about the orchestra. These are operas that are about musical structure. It's about what key signature the opera is in. It's about structure. It's about all of the ways that the instruments are working together to help tell the story. That is crucial to understanding the German mindset in this period, coming out of the world of Mozart and Beethoven and others. At that time. The French set themselves apart from this Italian and German musical system, and the French believed desperately in the total operatic experience. They absorbed as much as they could, but they maintained their French identity in opera by focusing on the theatrical experience. Almost every French opera incorporates dance. Almost every French opera of no matter what genre incorporates spectacle. What you see mixes with what you hear, which mixes and molds with what is happening in the theater around you. This is a total experience. In fact, some of the most spectacular scenes in all of opera come to us from the French tradition, where things like Mount Vesuvius erupting on stage is a plot point at the end of an opera. You have giant moments of history, giant epic battles are depicted on stage. There is a level of spectacle in these pieces that we must always look for. In contrast to this, there is also an emphasis in the intimate drama. The way that French composers deal with the French language, the loving care, the caressing that they have in setting the language is beautiful and vital for understanding and getting into the world of these pieces. And the characters in French opera tend to be a little more fully realized a little earlier than a lot of the other operatic styles. These are pieces that tend to be relatively intimate. They are characters who we can recognize, especially when you contrast them with the gods of Wagner's operas and the kind of over-the-top grandeur of that style. These are pieces that we recognize. These are people that we recognize. Notice this afternoon in Manon how real Manon is, that she's a character, a person you probably know. For example, one of her great arias, one of the great arias in the entire French repertoire, Adieu mon petite table, is an aria that she says that is set with the most sumptuous melody, and yet the text, she is saying goodbye to a small piece of furniture where she and her lover Des Grieux have enjoyed evenings together. If you think of a modern parallel, this is an aria, this explosion of musical drama over, let's say, a modern couple who just finished putting together their IKEA furniture, and then their lives are torn apart and they have to sell it on Craigslist. This is an aria about that intimate moment that we can recognize, and that is vital in the French style as well. This total dramatic style of opera that was prominent in the 1800s. Now, I mentioned French culture, French art, French music loves to divide things. They love taxonomies, they love rules. And so it wasn't enough just to have this French style of opera. You then had all of these subdivisions, these subgenres within French opera. Again, this is getting us into the mindset of the audiences who would have been there in 1884 at the premiere of Manon. The first of these great French styles is the French Grand Opera. These are the biggest of the spectacles, and they are in 5 acts. Manon is also in 5 acts, and although it is not a French Grand Opera, we see some of that influence coming into the music in the opera that you'll experience this afternoon. You also have the Théâtre Lyrique, the Opéra Comique, and the Théâtre Italien. These were 4 different buildings, and where your opera premiered and where you went to go see shows determined the structure, the audience expectations of what you are going to see. Notice that in that last example on the slide, the Théâtre Italien, notice that that's the Italian theater. So they tried to push the Italians off to a theater on their own to mitigate, if you will, the Italian influence on French art. In the midst of all of the turmoil that we have briefly mentioned and talked through this afternoon, you get this sense, this terror that the French culture, this one area of stability, is going to be taken away or be corrupted by outside influences. And so they put the Italians off in their own theater. Manon premiered in 1884 at the Opéra Comique. This building housed operas that were lighter in tone than what was premiering at the French Grand Opera. These aren't necessarily comedies. This isn't like where you went to go see, a romantic comedy or something, but they were pieces that weren't about giant historical epics. These are pieces that weren't about, showing the Bible unfold on stage or what have you. These are pieces that are a little more everyday, a little more intimate. They have music that is much more popular. That's important to keep in mind as well. Pieces that the melodies sing. They were also pieces that always incorporated dialogue. Now, the opera comique genre was turned on its head in 1875 when Carmen premiered. Carmen was originally opera comique. And so it has dialogue, it has all of those great tunes that we expect to have in opera comique, and yet it elevated the genre. It elevated the level of dramatic realism, the realism of the characters, the fire and the passion that could be shown on the opera comique stage. And so we see hints of this, of Bizet's passion in this new style of opera comique in Manon. But by virtue of premiering at this theater, you're going to hear some dialogue, you're going to hear lots of great tunes, and you're going to hear a smaller, more intimate, more human-scaled genre. Now, it's in 5 acts, so we have that French grand influence, but we have this world of the opera comique. And so that is going to be an important thing to keep in mind as you experience the opera this afternoon. Pay attention to the amount of times when we have a technique called melodrama, which is where there is dialogue happening between the characters, but the orchestra is still playing. They're underscoring the events on stage. We see Massenet kind of play with the traditional mold of opera comique and still bring the passion of his orchestra, bring the drama that he was so great about really understanding, bringing that to the forefront. So now to quickly recap, we've talked a little bit about the origins of Manon with the original novel from the early 1700s by Abbé Prévost. We've talked about the overall turmoil of French political and society during the 1800s, and then all of these different rules and different genres and the specific nature of French opera itself. Let's dive in now to the life of Jules Massenet, the composer of this afternoon's opera, and one of my personal favorite composers in French opera. I think one of the reasons why I love personally Massenet so much is he's one of the few truly happy operatic composers. He did not have a legendary temper. He did not have tempestuous love affairs that ended in murder or great heartbreak. In fact, he had a lovely relationship with his wife. He apparently was a great dad. He had lovely relationships, cordial relationships with the composers of his own time period. This overall is just a really great guy. And in the middle of such a tumultuous, violent century filled with strong, tyrannical men, it is worth, including in opera, you get Wagner, for example, it's worth noting the triumph of a small, happy life that we get as represented through Jules Massenet. He's born in 1842 into a middle-class family. His mother was apparently a great musician. She taught him piano. She herself was an amateur composer. And they move to Paris, recognizing the musical talents of their young son, Jules. And he begins to study at the Paris Conservatory, which was a pretty new phenomenon at this time. In the 1850s, the idea of the musical conservatory, like the one that I'm in right now at Capital University, was kind of an invention of the post-Napoleonic Europe. And so he starts to study and he starts to win prizes. He starts to become noticed. In 1861, Ambroise Thomas, who was an operatic composer, very prominent at the time, his most famous work is probably the opera adaptation of Hamlet, becomes his teacher, and he plays in the orchestra pit of the Théâtre Lyrique, one of these subdivisions of French opera, and he sees how opera works up close. So even though he doesn't write operas till later in his life, he's absorbing all of the great dramas, the great tradition that was swirling around him in the middle of this tumultuous 19th century. In 1863, he wins the Prix de Rome, which is the most prominent of the composition prizes that he could win. And he travels to Rome, he learns the Italian tradition, and just sees more of the world outside of the Paris that he has almost exclusively been living in throughout much of his life. It's there that he meets his wife, the Mademoiselle de Saint-Marie, her nickname was Ninon, and they start to have kids, and year by year, he starts to write operas. He starts to write bigger symphonic works, and his fame starts to grow rung by rung by rung. And in 1884, he has his first great hit, and that is Manon, which premieres at the Opéra Comique in 1884. When you look at Massenet's life and you look at his work, it's sometimes hard to really pinpoint his style. Unlike composers like Wagner, unlike composers like Mozart, who you hear them on the radio, you put a CD in the CD player, you instantly know that it's Mozart. You instantly know that it's Wagner. Massenet is a little more enigmatic. He's a little more specific to each story that he's telling. Again, you have that French influence of the drama, of the story, of the total work of art driving the musical form itself. So when you listen to Manon, it's going to sound very different than his Cinderella adaptation, for example, Cendrillon, which is going to be very different from Werther, which is another intimate, very romantic capital R opera. Each opera is different, and that is really important to keep in mind. So in the midst of that, in the middle of all of this chameleon-like composition, ultimately there are a couple benchmarks that we can look for that pinpoint why Massenet was so good at writing opera. First of all, he is incredible at writing intimate stories. By the end of each opera by Massenet, whether it's Manon, Werther, Cendrillon, what have you, you get a sense of who these people are. Listen to the orchestra, listen to the tempi changes, the pacing of the music, when a character sings a high note and when they don't, when they recite on a monotone. We get a full sense of who these people are. And when we contrast the works of Massenet to the kind of bombast of Wagner, or even works of the French Grand Opera, notice how he deals with the orchestra. This orchestration must have been a breath of fresh air for audiences at that time. it's almost, the orchestra functions almost like a chamber orchestra as he's creating this intimate salon world of the final decades of the Ancien Regime in the early 1700s. So pay it close attention to that. Pay attention to his ability to absorb all kinds of musical influences. When characters are at their most passionate, you get music that almost sounds like Verismo Puccini or Leoncavallo, kind of large Italian, kind of singing and screaming at the top of their lungs, versus a more Baroque or 1700s style of dance. You get all of these different forms that are playing off of each other. You get melodrama, that technique that I already mentioned, where you're speaking underneath the orchestra that is underscoring the dialogue. That wonderful play on the opera comique convention of needing to have dialogue. You're also going to hear a lot of Baroque flourishes. You're going to hear a lot of trills. You're going to hear music that sounds more like the early 1700s. And so Massenet does a beautiful job of weaving together his own musical styles, the musical styles of the 1800s, and the musical styles of the 1700s, all of that coming together. Massenet also uses musical themes. Pay attention whenever a character enters the stage, because that music is going to reoccur. They're called reminiscence motives. And so when you find yourself thinking, oh, I've heard that music before, I know that music, you have. It has been set up earlier in the opera and comes through almost as a memory, a reminiscence throughout the work itself. And then finally, you're going to hear great psychology in these characters. I think singers love singing the operas of Massenet because they get into the minds of these people. And the music, what Massenet does with the score, so beautifully takes us into the headspace of these characters. And so as Manon has to decide, is she going to go with the society that she's been raised in? Is she going to follow wealth in order to become as powerful as she can be? Or is she going to follow her heart and shun the world in which she's been raised? We hear that tension in the music, the way that the tempi are played with as she struggles with this change. Some things to watch for this afternoon, in addition to just the musical score. Pay attention to the costume design. Our director, Christine McIntyre, did a wonderful talk earlier this week about all of the fashion choices in the world of fashion in this Ancien Regime France. I highly recommend you checking that out. But pay attention to how the clothing is helping to tell this story as well. Notice how the more constricting the clothing gets for Manon, the less freedom that she really has. Notice how she is viewed as a work of art, and so maybe her humanity is diminished. There's this constant play with costuming. This period was elegant. The world of Manon, the early 1700s. It is elegant. It is beautiful. It is light. It is feminine. We see that in the scenic design, in the kind of French fan periactoid set that you'll see unfolding this afternoon. Incredible lightness and pastel, and yet all of this, don't forget, was meant to oppress. All of this was meant to show off wealth and power and keep people in their place. And that is an important thing to remember. Otherwise, our understanding of Manon becomes diminished. She can seem like kind of not that great of a character. We don't really understand her conflict if we don't keep in mind the reason that it is so airy, that it is so beautiful and so elegant. Pay close attention also to the staging, because this is not, a grand work like Wagner that is filled with, gods and really takes us larger than life. Pay attention to how this opera is staged to recreate life, even in the not really realistic world of opera. And that brings out wonderful acting performances that our director and conductor have pulled out of this phenomenal cast. And so in the midst of this world of political turmoil, whether it's in our time, whether it's in the time of the audiences in the 19th century, sitting down at the opera was a chance to be stable, to relish French culture, to relish their own culture, to sit back and be swept up by beautiful music that was lovingly crafted, that tells stories we can recognize, psychology that we can understand, and an intimate story is spun in front of you for a number of hours that allows you to really delve into the human experience in this beautiful, beautiful way. I hope that our time over the past half hour has given you some insight into where audiences were coming from, how this style of opera is different than other operatic styles that were at that time, and gets a little bit into why Massenet is so good at what he does and why this piece is worthy of performance so many decades after its initial premiere. We are almost exactly out of time, but if anyone has any questions, please just post them in the chat. I would love to answer or clarify anything that came up this afternoon, anything that I didn't address. And I encourage you all to go to the chat, go to the comment section, and you will see the postings, if you will, for where to stream Massenet this afternoon. I hope you take the opportunity also to grab a glass of wine, champagne, maybe popcorn. That's a DMMO tradition, and really relish being able to see this wonderful afternoon. See this opera this afternoon. Any questions? No? Well, if you do, please don't hesitate to reach out to us on Facebook, on various comments. We'll be happy to answer any questions that you may have. I sincerely hope you enjoy Manon this afternoon. I know I will, and I look forward to seeing you all next weekend, where we dive into Dvorak's wonderful fairy tale, Rusalka. Enjoy the opera, and thank you so much.